program is part of the award-winning series Profiles in Literature, featuring interviews with persons prominent in American literature for children. The moderator of this series is Dr. Jaqueline Shachter Weiss.
Long before the American Library Association announced Lois Lowry as its 1990 Newbery Medal winner, Profiles in Literature prophetically invited her for this interview. It's a joy to welcome you.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here.
Joining me is my Profiles colleague, Carolyn Field, Coordinator Emerita of the Office of Work with Children of the Free Library of Philadelphia.
It's awfully nice of you to come down from Boston to be with us today, Lois.
Oh, thank you.
Glad to have you here. Now, we're going to look at some pictures of your personal life. This first picture is of the living room of your apartment in Boston. Mm-hmm. Is this your main residence?
Yeah, this is where my body lives most of the time, and my head. I think your next picture is going to show where my heart lives. However.
Well, now this next picture is of your vacation home in New Hampshire.
Yeah, it's where I spend every weekend.
How old is this farmhouse?
Well, rumor has it that it was built around the turn of the 19th century, early 1800s, so it's getting close to 200 years old, and it shows its age like most of us old folks.
That's wonderful. Now, this is a nice wintry scene outside.
Yeah.
And then we have this photo of the summer, where the beautiful lush gardens are in bloom.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I spend most weekends there, and it's very different winter and summer, and you can see that it's a neat place to be, quiet both times of year.
Now, who are these charming people in this picture?
Well, those are my two charming daughters and my very often but not always charming grandson, my older daughter Alex and my younger daughter Kristen. The child is Kristen's little boy, whose name is James Michael. He was named for James and the Giant Peach, and he's only 2 in this picture, but he's now 7 years old, so he's read that book for himself.
Really grown up.
Uh-huh.
And you have 2 sons. Now, where was this picture of Gray, the older son, taken, and what does he do? Well,
yeah, you can tell that it's an unusual background. He lives in Germany, and for a while he did indeed live in this castle, 12th century castle. He's an Air Force pilot, an F-15 pilot. After he married, his wife didn't want to live in a castle. She wanted a dishwasher, and so they no longer live in the castle, but that's my son, Gray.
And now you have another son, and what does he do, and what's his name?
Well, this is Ben, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of his wife. Ben is my youngest child. He's in his 2nd year of law school, and he's married to a kindergarten nursery school teacher.
Oh. And what do the girls do?
Well, it's tough for me to understand exactly what they do because they're both in the field of computers, which is a field about which I know nothing, but that's what they do.
We'll leave your talented children for a moment to discuss you as a child. How is it that you learned to read and write when you were only 3?
Well, probably for 2 reasons. One is that my mother, before she married, had been a teacher, a kindergarten teacher, so she was accustomed to small children and books, and she was a great reader to her children, my sister and me. But my sister is the other reason. She was 3 years older, so when I was 3, she was 6 years old and bringing home her books from school. And I think it was probably my sister who taught me to read when I was that little.
Because you already knew how to read, what grade did you skip?
Well, I went to 1st grade like other children my age, but as you say, I already read well. And in those days, I think they were a little cavalier about saying, well, this one can read, let's put her in another classroom. So next thing I knew, I was in 3rd grade. And that meant that I never learned, in fact, I never even knew the name of it till my grandson told me, cursive writing. So I've always faked that all my life. What I'm really doing is printing and connecting the letters together, because that's what they learned in 2nd grade.
Oh. You have a gap.
Yes, a few.
In World War II, why did you start public school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania?
My father was an Army officer, career Army officer. As a matter of fact, he was an Army dentist. That's why I was born in Honolulu before Pearl Harbor. And when World War II started, after Pearl Harbor, he had to go overseas to the Pacific. So my mother's family was in Pennsylvania, and we went back there to live in my grandparents' house, and my baby brother was born there. All of that happens in the book Autumn Street, which I wrote many years later.
It's superb. I love Autumn Street.
Thank you.
Autumn Street was an honor book of the International Board on Books for Young People, and also an American Library Association notable book. Is the tale in that book of Charles, your beloved housekeeper's grandson, factual?
It is, but like all fiction, like all nonfiction / fiction, it's greatly changed. The real child, the housekeeper, incidentally, the cook, was a real person, and I think she was truly as I portrayed her in the book. And she saw the book before she died. I took it to her when she was 95 years old. Her grandchild was a girl, and the little girl's name was Gloria. But when I was writing the book, it was so populated by females, and that was because of the war. My father was gone, and
Right.
I had a sister, and we lived with my grandmother, and the grandfather is a tangential figure. But I suddenly realized there were so many females that I took the real little girl and turned her into a boy, and named the little boy Charles. But the real little girl was indeed later murdered. So the basis of the story was autobiographical, although the town, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was never named in the book.
That's true. I'm just now recalling.
And the real street was College Street.
I see.
My grandfather's house, last I heard, is now the economics department of Dickinson College.
My, how interesting. In Autumn Street, the young protagonist gropes toward integration when denied visits to the home of Charles, an African-American child. She also realizes that the mother of a white classmate, Louise, wouldn't be welcome in grandfather's house because of socioeconomic differences. I enjoyed your observation that Louise's family members spoke louder when they were embarrassed. What's the theme of Autumn Street?
Oh, golly. You know, you're calling upon both my memories of my childhood and my memories of that book, which I wrote some 10 years ago and haven't reread for many years. I think the theme, if you know, authors are fortunate. They don't have to. It's professors who have to tell the themes. Authors are rarely called upon to do so. But the theme in that book, I think, has to do with loss of innocence in many ways, and coming to terms with those things, as the child does in the book, as we all have had to do in our own lives. I condensed a number of things that really happened, but put them into a smaller time span than their actual occurrences. But there they all are, placing themselves on top of this very, very innocent child at a particularly fragile time, wartime.
In A Summer to Die, you wrote about the death of your sister Helen, who was, what, 3 years older than you, something like that. Did Helen die, as Molly did in the book, of leukemia when she was age 15?
No, again, I've done the same thing there. A Summer to Die is also based on things that really happened to me, but it's more fictionalized than Autumn Street was. My sister Helen was 3 years older than I, and she died when, gosh, I think she was 29 and I was 26. What I did was, because I was aware that I was writing for a particular audience, a particular age level, I thought they would prefer reading about somebody their own age or slightly older. So I reduced the girls in age to 13 and 15, changed their names. I never liked my name anyway. I get a kick out of changing it in books. My sister did die of cancer, but I changed the elements of that in the book slightly because my sister spent a lot of time in the hospital and had a lot of surgery. And I didn't want to write a book about medical procedures. There have been books done in that way, and some of them very good ones. But I wanted the sister, if not to die at home, at least to spend most of her final months at home. Obviously, that makes a better book in terms of writing about the family relationships, which I was trying to do.
Well, A Summer to Die was an American Library Association notable book, and also School Library Journal Best of the Best, which is great. In A Summer to Die, How did your experience as a photographer help you?
Well, I studied photography in graduate school, and it was something I started purely pragmatically. I got a few more course credits. Photography looks like fun. I discovered A, that I loved it, and B, that I was good at it. And so there was a period of time when I was writing for magazines, when I also worked as a professional photographer. Later, I did the cover for another book, but I'll tell you that later. However, I had not been a photographer as a child, but I wanted to take that field, which I loved so much, and put it into the book. And the editor raised the question, could a 13-year-old girl really have done these things in the darkroom? And I was able to assure him that everything she did in the darkroom was fairly simple, and yes, a bright, motivated 13-year-old could. So it was really neat to be able to use that in the book in sort of metaphoric ways as well.
Well, I think that's very interesting that you could use that experience.
Kids have liked it too.
Summer Dies late in rural Maine, right?
Well, the state is never mentioned.
You never mentioned where it is.
I lived in Maine when I wrote the book, so I pictured Maine or New Hampshire, and certainly northern New England. The only geography that's specifically mentioned is Portland. The child goes to the hospital in Portland. Well, you and I know it's Maine, but when that book won the California Young Readers Medal, a little girl stood up to make a speech to present me the medal in Los Angeles, and she said, and it's set here on the northwest coast of the United States. Well, she was so nervous anyway, I didn't leap up and correct her, but she took it as Portland, Oregon. And I thought, well, hey, that's okay, because it sort of makes it seem more generic and more something that could have happened anywhere.
Well, now, how did your editor get you to do this book, Summer to Die?
I had been, as I mentioned, writing for magazines, and I had written a short story that appeared in, gosh, I could almost name the date if I thought about it a while, Red Book magazine, in the winter of perhaps 1975 or 76. It was a story for adults, but it was about a child, and it was told through the eyes of a child. An editor at Houghton Mifflin read that story and contacted me and said that I sounded like somebody who maybe ought to be writing for kids. And would I be interested in writing a book for Houghton Mifflin? They, of course, didn't promise to publish it, but it was so unusual to have an editor taking an interest in a manuscript. I didn't have to sit down, write a book, as most people do, and it's so frustrating. Write a book and then start sending it out to publishers whom you don't know. I had a publisher there waiting to look at it. And when it was finished, they did agree to publish it. Not, however, after, they didn't tell me this for years, one of the first readers, when I finally sent the manuscript in, it went to one of the lower level readers, and she hated it. She wrote a report on it that ended with the word yuck. But fortunately, other people read it. They felt terrible because here they'd asked me to write this book, and it arrived and somebody said yuck. So other people read it and they liked it, published it, and about 5 years later they showed me this first letter.
Was this Melanie?
It was Melanie Krupa who was the first editor, not the person who said yuck.
She's not the one that came
She then edited the book, and then during its publication period, she moved to another publishing company, so Walter Lorraine has been my editor at Houghton ever since.
And Houghton Mifflin is the primary publisher for
They've done
Lois Lowry. We skip from your first book to Number the Stars, one of your last. In 1990, it won this coveted Newbery Medal from the American Library Association. Shortly after your winning was announced, tell us what happened when the Today television show invited you to be a guest.
Oh gosh, I'll try to make it very brief, but it wasn't even shortly after. It was right at the same time when they called me from Chicago and said, we've awarded you the Newbery Medal. This was January 1990. They said, could you get on a plane this afternoon and go to New York and be on the Today Show tomorrow morning? So I said, sure. It was snowing outside, and I didn't take that into my consideration. I threw some clothes into a suitcase and took the Pan Am shuttle to New York at, I think, 4 o'clock for what it should have been a 1-hour flight. But it was snowing, and the plane got into the air, and it couldn't get out of the air, and it circled and circled and circled New York, and finally it ran out of, or almost ran out of fuel, and landed on an abandoned airstrip in upstate New York, where we sat until 11 o'clock at night. So I was on this plane for 7 hours, and Well, it would have been kind of an amusing experience, except you get tired after a while and hungry and they've run out of food. It's like almost a hijacking experience, plus which I kept being aware that they had said they'd pick me up from the Today Show at 6 in the morning, and it kept getting later and later. To make a long story short, I finally got to my hotel about 2 in the morning, and they did pick me up, and I got to the Today Show, and in the midst of sitting there waiting to be interviewed on the Today Show, they announced that the space shuttle was going off live, and they had to drop one interview. So they came and looked around at those of us sitting there waiting, and there was me, and there was a French movie actress, and there was Andrew Greeley, sexy priest, and so, of course, I was the one who got bumped. How could I not?
You can't win. Number the Stars, which takes place in 1943 in German-occupied Denmark, tells about the courage of Christians in saving Jewish Danes, helping them reach neutral Sweden. To what does the title refer?
Well, the title refers, it's taken from a psalm which is used in the book. I've forgotten the number of the psalm, but it appears, and probably, incidentally, I took it from a Revised Standard Edition, which probably was not yet published in 1943, so it would have read somewhat differently. But I used it in a number of ways metaphorically as well. It's tough to go into all of that, but of course the stars could refer to the stars that Jews in Europe had to wear during World War II under the Nazi regime. However, they did not in Denmark have to wear those stars, so that's sort of a little discrepancy there. But one of the characters in the book, the character whom I named Peter, was modeled after a real resistance leader, young man who was killed, and I saw those graves in Copenhagen, and they were numbered rather than given names. So the numbering was worked in there as well. It's pervasive, I think, throughout the book.
That's interesting. In this fine book, why didn't you have a Jewish character like Ellen Rosen do something independently, such as remove her necklace with the Jewish star when Nazis were about to question her?
Well, gosh, nobody's ever asked me that before, and here I am, and I have to think real fast. What you're asking me to do is go back into my mind when I was writing, and it's tough to remember what process I went through. But because I was writing about the relationship of two children, I guess that's why I had the Christian child whom I named Anne-Marie. Also, to increase the tension a little bit, purely as a plot device, if one child yanks it off another, it's a little more interesting than to have one child remove it for herself.
Also, wouldn't the Nazis have suspected Uncle Henrik when Great Aunt Bertha's coffin was brought into his house, but there was no burial for her?
Boy, you're really putting me on the spot here.
I love the book. I love the book, so I so finely read it and identified
Surely
with it.
the Nazis would have suspected everyone, particularly like an Uncle Henrik, a big, sturdy fisherman along the coast. The Nazis, in fact, did suspect everyone along the coast in those years. There were all sorts of gimmicks and devices that the Danes used, and fake funerals were one of them. I heard a story more recently, which I loved, where they did transport people in ambulances and used hospitals often, hospital beds, as hiding places for the Jews as they moved them toward the coast. And I heard the story recently where they had a Jewish person hidden in an ambulance, or not hidden, but disguised as a patient. And the question was raised by a nurse or doctor, if the Nazis stop us, what shall we say or what shall we write on the forms the diagnosis is? And the doctor said, put down German measles.
Oh,
so there are all sorts of wonderful stories from that time, and I just chose to use a fake funeral. And I suppose had I wanted to dwell on that more, I would have had a fake grave opened up for the next day so that they could have buried something and been less suspicious.
When your editor raised this question, how did you react? He was talking about too frequent references in the book to the Nazis' high, shiny boots.
Yeah, and I've told this story in Chicago recently, of course. First of all, I based the story on the experiences of a friend of mine, so I talked to her a great deal. She was a child during that time, and she had mentioned, when I asked her to describe the Nazi soldiers that were all over her city, she mentioned the boots, the high, shiny boots, the scary boots. Then when I looked up the old photographs, I could see that for myself, these terrifying boots. And much later, after the book had been written and I'd included the books a lot, my editor did call attention to the overuse, perhaps overuse, of that image. And at about that time, I want to make this quite brief, but I was in Australia. I met a woman who was wearing a necklace exactly the same as the necklace on the cover of the book. And so I asked her about it. It's not an unusual necklace, but it just struck my attention because it was exactly the same. And she described how she had been hidden as a child in Holland, a 2-year-old child, when they took her mother away. Her mother was Jewish, her father was not. And when I asked her what she remembered of that time, the first thing that came to her mind and to her memory was the high, shiny boots. So when I went back to the States, I asked Walter to leave them in. I said it was such an image,
yes.
and such a horrible, scary thing that I thought people should be reminded of what those boots represented.
Especially for a young child. Incidentally, what photograph did you take? What cover?
The cover of the book is Number of the Stars is a child a Swedish child whom I had photographed many years before.
Oh, that's a beautiful cover.
And when they asked me how I pictured the child in the book, I hadn't described her terribly much in the book, how I wanted her to look. I gave them the photograph thinking they could give it to the artist who would be doing the painting, and they called and said, wow, can we use the photograph?
Right.
So I had to get her permission.
Well, it is a beautiful, beautiful picture. But let's move on from this rather bitter period of history to fun.
Okay.
One of my favorite books, I think, is Anastasia Krupnik, which was also an American Library Association notable book.
Despite the bad word on page 90-something.
Yeah. It's the first of 8
I'm sorry you asked me that. I've just finished one, and I think it might be the 8th, or is it the 9th?
It'd be the 9th then.
A lot of them.
About a little girl, Anastasia, and her younger brother, Sam. Mm-hmm. Now, her mother was an artist, mm-hmm. and her father was a professor of literature at Harvard University. Mm-hmm. What sort of a reader reaction and response do you get to the Anastasia books?
Kids love them. And it's interesting to me that boys love them because they have a girl's name in the title. They have a girl's picture on the cover, mm-hmm. and you know that boys that age don't like to read books about girls. But because they're humorous, boys love them too, and that's kind of neat. I think they are an urban urban setting. They're set in Boston area, and a highly literate, highly educated family, white, middle class, and yet they do seem to go beyond that audience. And kids all over the country, all over the world, like them. They're in translation all over the world. It's like the Cosby Show, I think. So I get letters from all over, and they all seem to respond to the humor, even though their circumstances, they may not relate to the particular circumstances in the book.
Humor continues in your Rabble Starkey, mm-hmm. winner of the Boston Globe Hornbook Award, the Golden Kite Award, and an award from Bank Street College, among other prizes. Mm-hmm. This is the story of an unwed mother and hired housekeeper, Sweet Hosanna, and her 12-year-old daughter named Parable, but nicknamed Rabble. The girl speaks with an Appalachian dialect. The child doesn't feel deprived in her garage apartment home because she says feelings are the most important thing in a home. How did you feel about the splendid character development mm-hmm. of both mother and daughter in this book?
Well, I loved the characters in this book, in this particular book, and let me point out to you, though, that it's quite clear that she was married when she had that baby. You called her an unwed mother. She's a single mother.
You're
but
right.
She ran off
Thank
and married
you for
that guy when
correcting
she
me.
was 14
You're
years
right.
old.
She liked his
His
pickup
blue
truck.
pickup truck, yes.
His pickup truck. I'm so sorry. I failed to remember that.
Kids have written to me more than once and asked me if I would write a book in which Rabble and her mother move into Anastasia's neighborhood, and she and Anastasia become friends. Yeah, and that would be interesting.
Yeah.
However, I don't plan to do that. But I do love those characters. My brother and his wife live in that part of the country and have that slow. My nephews, if I say something to one of my own kids and they don't hear me or don't understand me, they'll say, "I beg your pardon." My nephews will look at me for a minute and then they'll say, "Ma'am," and it's just that slow cadence of speech, and also I think a very basic set of values reflected in that book that we in our fast-paced, more urban, sophisticated life somehow have lost sight of that more clearly cut and slowly moving life down there. And I guess that's why I chose to set the book in that place.
In your another book set in Maine, Find a Stranger, Say Goodbye, you show the 17-year-old daughter who's adopted of a physician. Here she searches for and finds her biological mother, who was unwed. That's where my confusion was, and who bore her at age 15. What prompted this book?
That was my second book, and it was written, golly, probably 1978. And at that particular time, it was somewhat new in the news, people making searches for their natural parents. So I think I had picked up on it from news articles. My own children are not adopted, nor was I, but I've had a number of friends who have adopted children. And I had one friend at that time who was a grown woman who had been adopted as an infant. She'd never had any interest or even given any thought to finding her natural mother, but during the period I knew her, and when I was writing that book, she suddenly got a letter from an unnamed university professor in a major university who was her mother and had given her up when she was 5 months old. So she had a meeting with her mother. So all of that was going together in my mind when the plot of that book is completely made up. And of course I could have ended it any way. She could have found anything when she found her natural mother. I chose one way. I still get letters from people who want it to end a different way. And of course it could have had any one of 100 endings.
But you have splendid recall of your growing up years. How does this help you in writing for children?
Well, I think what it does is people's memories work different ways. Let me quickly tell you a story from my 4th grade year. My teacher's name was Miss Louise Hickman, and she called me in after school because I had done something very naughty. I'd written a very nasty note to Ruthie Fisher is what I had done. And I had hurt Ruthie Fisher's feelings, and she called me in, and I stood by her desk while she scolded me. Now, I can remember that, and I can remember what she said, and I remember what I said to Ruthie Fisher in my note. But when I remember it, I can see Miss Heckman's dress, which was a dress that had little white figures on it, and I see them blurred. And the reason for that is because I'm seeing them through my 4th grade eyes, and I was crying. And I see them through tears, and I think that's the difference, because it makes me, having that kind of memory makes me remember the feelings and the perceptions coming out of me instead of looking back as if it were a TV show of my past.
What can you share about your current works in progress?
Well, this isn't going to be anything profound because what I've just finished is a new Anastasia book. I delivered it to my publisher last week, had lunch with my editor 2 days ago to discuss a couple of questions. But Anastasia's still 13, and in this particular book she's asked to be a junior bridesmaid in a wedding shortly after she has renounced marriage in her own future. And being Anastasia, the wedding turns into something of a disaster.
Well, we've heard about some of the ways in which you've gathered ideas.
I don't think we have time.
Are we running out already?
I'll have to come back for another time.
I can't believe it's been so short, it seems to me. Thank you very much. In addition to winning the Newbery Medal, Lois Lowry has had 5 of her works be declared American Library Association notable books. At the same time, she maintains her popularity with young people. She's either been nominated for or won Children's Choice Awards in the following states: Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Missouri, South Dakota, Texas, Utah, and West Virginia. That's quite a spread. One of the reasons for her popularity is her humor, which we see in this excerpt from Anastasia's chosen career. Anastasia, a teenager, has just had her hair styled by 3 elderly beauticians, and the quotation is, "She had read where all old elephants had a secret place to die." She imagined now, for the first time, a special secret place upstairs over a Chinese restaurant in Boston for ancient beauticians. She pictured them in distant cities, realizing that the time had come, packing up their plastic curlers and styling brushes, and starting across the country. Your humor sparkles and originality.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We look forward to your future.
Thank you.